My Name is Legion by Matt Sturchief. Just a few months ago, I was asked by the FBI to help catch a serial killer. It was the strangest thing I had ever been asked to do in my life. By the FBI of all people. Okay, technically, I wasn't asked. I volunteered to help. At the time, I wasn't in the most stable mental state. And when I heard that the FBI needed civilian volunteers to help catch the killer, I thought that this could be cool, and if I die, then who cares? It's amazing how almost dying can make someone turn their life around. Anyway, I figured out eventually that I was chosen because I had few friends and family, and that I was considered disposable. I would have felt offended, but I couldn't really have argued with them on that point. So this killer had been plaguing the city for a few weeks then, and they were all over the news. At the side of every murder was the word Legion in jagged letters, written in the blood of the victim. The strangest thing was that the blood was the only part of the victim found. There was no body or DNA from the killer anywhere. This guy also clearly knew what he was doing, as he knew how to avoid CCTV and security cameras. The footage recorded closest to any of the victims' deaths was 2 minutes prior. In just 2 weeks, Legion had already claimed 8 victims, and the police force was in a panic. It was even theorized that there may have been multiple killers, about based on the name. That was when the FBI stepped in and told the local police that they would take over the case. The FBI led the investigation for another 3 weeks in total secrecy, during which time Legion claimed 11 more victims, 7 of which were FBI agents. I later learned that Legion only went after civilians, and the dead agents were the ones who had gotten in his way while he was trying to commit a murder. Even after being present for several of Legion's killings, they still had no information on him. There was no pattern for who he killed, his methods, or even how he made the bodies disappear. Even his or her gender was still unknown. We eventually discovered that it was, in fact, a he. Well, we're pretty sure at least, but more on that later. The only information that had been gathered on his appearance was that he wore long pants and a hoodie. But in January, where I live, this isn't exactly the warmest spot, so that's a pretty common look. Once I had been selected by the FBI's super-secret encrypted email, which had been sent to several selected citizens asking for volunteers, I had to meet an undercover agent at a coffee shop. The meeting was staged to look like I had just met an old friend, so as to not draw suspicion that I was working to catch Legion. What the FBI had gathered is that Legion seemed to know who was and wasn't FBI, as they had tried having several agents pose as civilians. Based on other information, Legion had actively avoided those people. I met with the agent a total of 3 times, where I was briefed on much of what had been gathered and what I would be doing. I was to act natural, go about my day, and hope that Legion would target me. I would have agents watching me whenever I was out of my house, and the FBI would try to subtly draw attention to me, though I have no idea how they would do that. The last meeting was by far the most unnerving, and I saw this after learning the grisly details of some of Legion's murders. I was given a pill, which I was told was cyanide. If Legion spoke to me at all, I was to take the pill. If he said any words to me at all, if he so much as opened his mouth, I was to kill myself. The agent concluded the meeting with that and left me in the coffee shop, very confused and holding a suicide pill. Part of trying to get Legion to target me, perhaps one of the attempts at subtly drawing attention to me, was to stay out late at night and linger around alleyways and places that didn't have any cameras watching them. I was walking through an alleyway when I heard footsteps behind me. I had a feeling that I knew who it was, but I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look into the eyes of a man who had killed 19 people in 3 months. The footsteps grew closer and closer. I was so terrified of the man behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Closer and closer the footsteps drew. I could have sworn I even heard whispering. Finally, I could no longer hear the steps behind me, and I snapped my body around to find a homeless man trailing behind me. He was clearly drunk and seemed to be muttering about needing money. I couldn't believe I nearly had a heart attack over a drunk beggar. I chuckled to myself and I turned back around. And I will never forget what I saw in front of me. There, mere inches from my face, stood Legion. He was wearing a hockey mask. Yes, a hockey mask. This definitely wasn't Jason, though. The mask looked old and grimy. Maybe it had once been white, but now it was a dark brown. There were scratches all over, and the most terrifying part, it highlighted his eyes brilliantly. Those eyes, they displayed so many emotions at once. Fear, terror, sadness, pain, joy, all wrapped up into one look. The irises also seemed to be constantly shifting color, though not like a flashing light. It's very hard to describe. It's as if when you looked away and looked back, they were a different color. But in the seconds that I stared at him, I never looked away, and I must have seen at least 10 different colors in those eyes. Like I said, it's very hard to describe. When Legion raised his kitchen knife in an ice pick grip like Michael Myers, I didn't waste another second. I ran. He laughed behind me. It wasn't the laugh of one man. It sounded like the laughter you would hear as the entire audience of a stand-up comedy show laughed, but with murderous intent. I looked back to see him running behind me just far enough that he couldn't reach me with his knife. In the moment that I looked back at my pursuer, I tripped over a piece of trash that was placed conveniently in the middle of my path. I skidded across the ground on my belly, and then I turned to face Legion. He was already above me, legs straddling my body. I went for a kick to the groin, but he anticipated this and knelt down to pin me. He raised the knife to strike, and without thinking, I spoke. "What are you?" I said. Before I realized that I had incited him to speak, he answered in the most horrendous voice, or rather voices, that I've ever heard. It was like the sound of thousands of people, men, women, children, all different accents, all speaking, with the harmony of a choir in a malicious tone. "My name is Legion, for we are many." I remembered the cyanide pill in my pocket and thought about what a mistake it was to open my mouth. As I dug for it, I wondered why I was trying to kill myself when there was a man about to stab me. But at this point, my logic had been shut off and instinct took over. Somehow I knew that ending my own life was much better than having it ended by Legion. Apparently, speaking was actually a very smart idea. The distraction had given the agents watching me enough time to get into position. One of them had snuck up behind Legion and whacked him over the head with some blunt object. The unconscious serial killer tumbled towards me and I rushed to stop the knife. But even as I pushed with all of my strength, somehow, the arm pushed back and drove the knife into my chest. It had, however, missed the intended target of my heart. It did also, however, do enough to hurt. Really bad. I very quickly found out that the physical pain was only the half of it. As the agents handcuffed the killer and then pulled him off of me, the world began to fade away. Now, I was no medical expert, but I knew that I couldn't be blacking out from pain or blood loss just yet. And I still felt fully conscious. "Join us," a voice whispered from behind me. The Legion whispered in a different voice. I looked in the direction of the voices to find what I can only describe as a tube of bodies. The entire world around me had faded away and had been replaced by a gray void, the tunnel being the only thing that I could see. It was made of hundreds of bodies, all looking malnourished and decayed, but they still spoke to me. The ones at the very edge even reached for me. I felt some force pull me towards the tunnel.
Join us. Join us, the Legion.
I shuddered as one of the cold, dead hands wrapped around my arm.
Join us, the many, the possessed, the Legion.
Legion himself then appeared in the tunnel. He now had a crude smile with jagged fangs drawn on his hockey mask in blood. He tilted his head to the side as he stared at me with those ever-shifting eyes.
Join us. Join us, the Legion.
As I was drawn closer, the killer also reached for me. Something then began to pull back. I couldn't see anything holding my other arm, but something had stopped the advance of my body towards the tunnel. I must have stayed like that for hours or days. The whispering of "join us" and "the Legion" never ceased. Eventually, the force pulling me away won the battle of tug-of-war with the body tube, and I was pulled back into the real world. I found myself in a hospital bed, and one FBI agent looking over me. They told me that I had been in a coma for a week, and that Legion had been apprehended and locked up awaiting trial. Apparently, this was going to be a difficult task, as Legion had not responded to any of the actions or words of his interrogators. He hadn't eaten or even moved from a kneeling position in the middle of a cell for a week. Right as he finished telling me this, his phone rang. When he answered, I could hear the voice on the other end saying two words: "He's moving." He then rushed out of the office and to presumably wherever Legion was being held. As soon as I was released from the hospital later that day, I was taken to the facility that Legion was being held in. His cell looked like a regular prison cell, but built in a square of reinforced steel, with a large one-way mirror and a camera up at the top of the 10-foot-high ceiling. It had a hallway going all the way around it and guards constantly watching him. After a week of sitting still and not even eating, Legion was now frantically pounding on the glass and screaming. We couldn't hear the screaming, however, as the cell was soundproofed. The body of one interrogator lay on the ground in a pool of blood, and a smile of fresh blood was drawn on Legion's mask. As soon as he saw me, however, the screaming stopped. Legion was wearing the same hoodie, pants, and mask as the night that we caught him. I was told that he resisted all forms of sedatives and used inhuman strength to break free of his captors when someone tried to remove his clothes or search his body. During his transport to the facility, he had apparently snapped the handcuffs on his wrist and had to be restrained again after another chase on foot. When the officers saw Legion's reactions to me, it was decided that I act as a mediator on Legion's interrogation. I was given a thing that looked like an earbud and told to use an intercom to talk to Legion. If the interrogator said anything on the earbud, then I would say it to Legion. I approached the cell, apprehensive, and pressed down on the intercom button. I had looked down to do so, and when I looked up, Legion's mask was pressed to the glass right in front of me. I jumped back, but quickly recovered. Listen, you gotta tell us about all the people you killed," I said, and I heard an audible sigh from the earbud. The interrogator tried to say something, but he was cut off by Legion saying,
"My name is Legion, for we are many."
"Yeah, man, I know. I know your name's Legion," I said.
"What are you doing?"
The man on the earbud asked me. "Sorry, I couldn't hear you when he said that," I responded.
"Said what?"
the voice said. When he said that my name is Legion.
What are you talking about? He hasn't said anything.
The man was cut off again when Legion spoke again in his distorted, multiple voices.
You will be the hand of the Legion.
Say what?
The man on the earbud began saying something again, but I took it out of my ear.
You will be the hand of the Legion. You are connected to us. This body is now useless to us. You will be the new hand of Legion.
Yeah, no thanks, I told him.
It's not your choice. Your connection to us cannot be broken. You will be the...
Yeah, I'll be the new hand of the Legion. Listen, you're clearly sick and you need help. We can get you the help you need if you cooperate.
Still, you deny us. No matter. We will take you.
Legion then removed his hood and mask, something a few officers had broken limbs trying to forcefully do. I saw the face of a man who couldn't be more than 25, covered in dirt. His hair and beard were long, unkempt, and oily, like he hadn't showered or shaved in weeks. He then pulled a knife from one of his shoes. The officers rushed to stop him, but he quickly killed himself with the knife. He was dead before the cell door even opened. In fact, when an autopsy was performed, it was discovered that the man had died about a month ago from dehydration. His skin and general outer body showed no signs of decay, but his insides showed otherwise. Now, the FBI was completely baffled, and the thing that probably bothered most of the officers was that the hockey mask Legion had worn was nowhere to be found by the time they searched his cell. The officers asked me what I had been doing talking to Legion like that. I told them that I was just having a conversation with him, and they told me that when I had removed the earbud, I hadn't put my finger back on the intercom button. There was no way I could have been talking to him. I then asked them if they had heard his weird voice, and they said that there were multiple microphones inside the cell, and Legion hadn't spoken a word. It wasn't exactly a satisfactory end, but Legion had been stopped, and I was given a reward of $40,000 for my help. It was even less satisfactory when the killings began again a month later. This new Legion was dubbed a copycat killer, and I suppose that they were right, in a way. I was asked if I would help catch this new killer, but I told them that I had had my fill of chasing crazy people. In truth, their search is hopeless, and Legion will never be stopped. Even if they contain the body, they can never contain the mind. Legion will live on forever, killing and taking lives. My name is Legion, for we are many, and we will never be cast out. This is from the handwritten journal of Mark Scott, the Legion copycat killer. After a month of tracking his killings, Scott was tracked to his home where police moved in to arrest him. He ran from his house with a knife drawn, and officers opened fire. He was shot a total of 37 times and hit with a grenade before he could be restrained. Even after having one of his legs blown off and several lethal gunshot wounds, Scott didn't die. It was theorized that he had taken a large amount of drugs before rushing the officers, which had allowed him to stay alive. But an autopsy showed no signs of drugs in his system. In fact, evidence showed that he had been dead for several weeks. It is hoped that Legion has been put to rest for good. However, the officer that retrieved the papers from Scott's home has been acting very strangely ever since that day. He will often mutter to himself and his arms will spasm. And worst of all, he keeps whispering about the Legion.